Hello, everyone. My name is Nisha Taplial, and I will be your host for this webinar today. I would like to start by acknowledging the country that we're on here in Australia. We acknowledge the land, waterways, and airways of the First Nations people on which we work, study, and live and gather for the event, including the traditional custodians of the Dharawal people where I am and the Kulin Nations where my co-host Mudit is. We would like to pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. We would like to pay our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may have joined us today. Hello again. Thank you for joining us. I want to say thank you particularly because we're all in the middle of such difficult times, and my head and heart are in India all the time right now, even though I'm physically here in Australia. And there are really no words, I think, to describe what is going on. So I thought instead of talking about how difficult and tragic circumstances are, I would just ask you to join me in a moment of silence to honor the people we've lost, all the people we know who are suffering. So if that's okay with everyone, we'll just take a minute of silence to think about all these people. Thanks, Aditya. Thanks again. And just to wish all of you strength because there are more difficult times to come. But thank you for joining me in that moment. So again, I am Nisha Taplial. I am an academic at the University of Newcastle and the organizer of this webinar series, Educate, Organize, Resist. But before I tell you about myself, I would like to introduce my co-host, Mudit Vyas, who, without whom this series would not be possible. So Mudit, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Nisha. Hi, everyone. I am Mudit. I'm from India, and I'm Nisha's research assistant, but I'm assisting her with this project, which is called Educate, Organize, Resist, which Nisha will introduce later. I am a research student at Monash University in Melbourne, and I study media economics and creative industries from the lens of Brahminism. Yeah, that's part. Thanks.
So this webinar series has come about as part of a larger research project that I've been working on for the last 6 months or so now, which documents and maps resistance to ethno-religious nationalisms and particularly Hindu nationalisms in the diaspora. And I feel very fortunate that through this project, I have met incredibly inspiring activists and scholars, some of whom I hope to be able to share, to bring to you through this webinar series, including the two people who are going to speak to you today. So the people who I've invited to speak in this webinar series have a great deal of wisdom and experience with different forms of resistance, including direct action, street protests that I think we're all familiar with, but also political advocacy and lobbying, popular education, political arts, political media, awareness raising, and transnational coalition building. And so we hope our first speaker in the series was Dr. Biju Matthew last month, and we have the speakers today and an exciting lineup coming up for you soon, including the next webinar in June with Dr. Sangeeta Kamath, that's called Counteracting Hindutva in the Diaspora, Critical Education Through Youth Solidarity Summers. And we're hoping to bring together a really exciting group of educators who will talk about their experiences working with South Asian youth in the US diaspora to counter the influence of Hindu nationalist forces, whom, as most of us know, are particularly active in spaces of education and culture, and youth and children are a particular focus of their activism. The speakers have also asked me to talk a little bit about Hindu nationalism or Hindutva, a term you'll hear for the next hour and a half. So please bear with me. I'm going to speak for just a little bit longer before I introduce our speakers for today. So for those of you who might be relatively new to this conversation, here's a quick overview. The term Hindutva was coined by Veer Savarkar, the chief ideologue of the nationalist movement that emerged in India about 100 years ago during the struggle for independence. And he coined the term to distinguish between Hinduism, which is a religion, and his particular cultural nationalist ideology, which forms the foundation of the phenomenon that we're talking about today. Hindu nationalism or Hindutva is essentially a supremacist ideology with elements of racism, colorism, casteism, patriarchy, religious intolerance, and of course, violent nationalism. Like all supremacist discourses, it evokes a false discourse of meritocracy, but what it's really talking about is social Darwinism, and with a very hierarchical worldview. This is an ideology that justifies itself by drawing on ideas of a mythical Hindu past, as well as a vision of society in future, which is modeled on this mythical Hindu past. And of course, this vision is a fundamentally unequal vision. It's a fundamentally unequal social order with the Brahmin caste on top, the priest caste on top, occupying the highest place simply by luck of birth, I suppose. One scholar and media commentator that I read recently, Rajiv Bhargava, calls it the most perfect form of conservatism because it allows elites to perpetuate their social status, power, and privilege, right? And it seems perfectly normal in this ideology. A little more about the formal structures and organizations that put the ideology of Hindutva into practice. You're going to hear some groups and organizations referred to, some acronyms, so just to make sure we're all on the same page. It all started with the Rashtriya Swayamsevak, or the RSS, literally translated in English to the National Volunteer Corps. They were founded in 27 September 1925, and this organization is the heart of the Hindutva movement today. It is a militia type organization. Early influences on this movement included European fascists like Mussolini in Italy and Hitler in Germany. They were key sources of inspiration for Hindutva ideologues like Veer Savarkar and M.S. Golwalkar, who were fundamentally obsessed with the minorities problem and the dangers of foreign races and invaders to the national race, which are Hindus and can only be Hindus in this worldview and way of thinking. The RSS were banned during British rule and banned again thrice after India gained independence. Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated by an RSS militant, Nathuram Godse. The Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, which is in power today, is the official political party of this movement. It was founded in 1980 after a previous unsuccessful events to set up a viable political front for this movement. So the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi is a lifelong member of the RSS. He was the Chief Minister of Gujarat in 2002 at the time of the Muslim genocide. He also played a key role as a grassroots RSS organizer in the events leading up to the destruction of the 14th century Muslim mosque, the Babri Masjid in Ayodhya. In his first term in national office, which began in 2014, he focused on pro-market reforms, while Hindutva thugs were allowed to roam with impunity, carrying out violence against cultural and religious minorities, including Muslims and Dalits. In his second term, however, which began in 2019, he has embarked on a blatant project of ethnic cleansing with anti-constitutional and anti-minority policies in Kashmir, and then the Citizenship Amendment Bill, NRC, and so forth, which I know many of you have personally protested against wherever you are. And he has rebranded, despite his right-wing roots, Modi has rebranded himself quite successfully as a tech-savvy, uber-managerial Vikas Purush or development man. But of course, we are now seeing his utter failure in managing the COVID-19 pandemic in India. And yet again, hundreds of thousands of people are paying with their lives as he, response to the pandemic is another image management exercise. A little bit about transnational Hindutva, or how this ideology and its networks have spread through the Indian diaspora around the world. We now have 4 decades of research on this topic, mainly in the US and the UK. But thanks to this research, we know that the RSS family, it's a very large network of organizations, has an organized transnational presence everywhere in the Indian diaspora under the umbrella of the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh, or HSS for short, as well as the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the World Hindu Council, or VHP. The research tells us that this is a highly organized, but also highly centralized network, which has been very quick to exploit the affordances of advances in internet communications technologies. They first used the internet to create an alternative cyber refuge, if you will, for migrants, Hindu migrants, looking for a sense of belonging and connection to their home country and even a spiritual community. But 2 decades or even 3 decades on, the internet now provides a space for organizing, mobilizing, raising funds, and to promote a very powerful, effective discourse of Hindu victimhood in Western multicultural societies. So this is a key point of distinction between Hindutva in India, which is unapologetically illiberal and right-wing, and the way that the same groups, the same ideologies present themselves outside India, particularly in Western liberal multicultural context. I've already said this, but the other thing we know is that education is central to their strategic repertoire, and they do this both through their internal educational programs and processes, but also by systematically targeting educational institutions wherever they are, and these include schools and university campuses. And most recently, we've seen this in the sustained and organized attack on Professor Audrey Truchet at Rutgers University. And just to wrap this up, right here in Australia and New Zealand, where we are located, we know that these organizations are present for at least a decade. They masquerade as Hindu charitable and cultural organizations, but they're very much linked with this transnational network. The groups and organizations that we're aware of include the HSS Australia, VHP Australia, Australian Hindu Council, Seva International Australia, and the Chinmaya Mission. And one of the exciting things happening here is that we're engaging in a more systematic mapping of which Hindutva groups are here and which areas of work they're involved in. We've also learned through our research that 3 Hindutva affiliated organizations are currently registered providers of Hinduism in public secondary schools in New South Wales, which is the state in which I'm located. We also know they have links to Hindu student associations on 2 university campuses here in my state. So, keep your eye on this space, and we'll keep updating you also as our research progresses. So that's the wrap up of my little overview to Hindu nationalism and Hindu nationalism in the diaspora, which I hope provides a little bit of context for the talk you're about to hear. And it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. These are two activist scholars who inspire me. And I'm very happy to have them join us today to take time out of their very, very busy schedules. Since I cannot possibly do justice to all their accomplishments, I thought I would just share two quotations from some of their work that I have been reading recently, right? To share a little bit about why they inspire me and why what they're about to talk to us will resonate with our experiences here in Australia and wherever else people might be. So the first quotation is from an essay, a 2014 essay by Radha, entitled "What Can Activist Scholars Learn from Rumi?" Published in Philosophy East and West. And the quote is, "Emancipation requires two types of knowledge, a knowledge of constraint, the cage that imprisons us, and a knowledge of how to be free, how to get out of the cage. Knowledge of constraint does not automatically or logically or necessarily show the way to freedom." Now, there's a great deal being said here, but to me, reading this quote just before our conversation today reminded me of many of the questions that we wrestle with working in this space, right? And these questions have to do not only with what's wrong, but why don't people see what's wrong? Why are people attracted to this ideology? Why are they not listening to us when we present alternatives? And so it reminds me not only of the importance as activists of providing a critique of dissent, but also about talking about the alternatives. What is the vision? What is the world? What is the society that we would like to see in place of this ideology of hate and violence? And I often, and I'm reminded that perhaps sometimes we put more work into the critique and not quite as much work as we need to into the second question about what are we working towards? What alternative would we like to offer instead? And the second quote comes from Adrija's recent work. This is a little blog she published in the Feminist Review, "Breaking the Locks, a New Phase in the Indian Women's Movement," which is based on her doctoral research and her published book. And it reads, "In a space so oppressive, the voice of women demanding change reverberated in every corner." And here she's describing an activist space she encountered while documenting the women's movements that sprung up on campuses across India following the 2013 gang rape of the woman that came to be called Nirbhaya. So she's describing what she saw in one of these activist spaces on a university campus. "The tides are changing as they must. The fear of the administration was visible, but so was the celebration of women coming together against all odds and fighting for change. The bleakness of the campus was lit up with the colors of freedom. There are different ways to resist oppression, and the celebrations of women and their individual and collective voices are perhaps the best way to resist against institutions that work every day to silence women." And to me, this quote was a much needed reminder, not only about how powerful qualitative research can be, and this is an excellent example of feminist qualitative research from Adrija, but also the importance of celebrating spaces of resistance. Too often, I think, as activists, we sort of look back and only remember the failures, or we might celebrate some successes, but we forget to be in the moment and celebrate these spaces we've created and these voices that we've amplified. And so I wanted to share this quote with you because I believe that the spaces of campus activism that have emerged since 2014, regardless of the short-term outcomes, are deeply transformative spaces that will impact not only the people who participated in the movements at that moment, but generations to come. So that's just to give you a flavor of who you're about to listen to. And with that, slightly more formal introductions. Dr. Radha D'Souza is a critical scholar, social justice activist, barrister, and writer from India. She is Professor of International Law, Development, and Conflict Studies at the University of Westminster. She has also taught law and development studies in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and practiced law in the High Court of Mumbai in the areas of labor rights, constitutional and administrative law, public interest litigation, and human rights. She is a lifelong trade unionist and a democratic rights activist. One of her most recent publications that I think is relevant to our conversation today is her book published in 2018, What's Wrong with Rights? Social Movements, Law, and Liberal Imagination. And that book exemplifies her work as an activist scholar. She has worked to promote international solidarity with social justice movements in India and the Asia Pacific region, particularly with a focus on the detrimental effects of international economic policies on so-called developing countries. Most recently, she has worked with the Campaign Against Criminalizing Communities in the UK, or CAMPAC for short, which has documented and critically analyzed the impacts of a rapidly expanding global counter-terror regime, the impacts on migrant communities of color in the UK, including Tamils, Kurds, and Somalis. So that's a very brief and limited introduction to Radha, who will be the first of our speakers today. Our second speaker is Dr. Adrija Dey, who is currently a British Academy postdoctoral research fellow at the SOAS South Asia Institute. Her research interests include digital feminism, feminist activism, student movements, and looking at universities as sites of repression and counter struggle, some of which is published in her book, which I just mentioned, which was published in 2018. The title is Nirbhaya, New Media, and Digital Gender Activism. Adrija is also a lifelong activist who has participated in grassroots struggles in India and West Bengal. She has also been involved in campus-based activism in England for the last 5 years. In particular, she has played a key role in the creation of the South Asian Students Against Fascism, UK, which amongst many other things, organized a 12-hour sit-in in 2019 in solidarity with anti-CA protests in India at the time, together with the SOAS India Society, to which she also belongs. So with that, I know you will all join me, in extending a warm welcome to the speakers. They will speak for approximately 45 minutes or as long as they wish, and then we will use the remainder of the time for question and answers. Just a few quick house rules. This is a 90-minute event. It will be recorded, and the recording will be shared on our YouTube channel. We are not live streaming this event. Please do feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. We ask only that you type your questions in the Q&A forum if you want your questions to be answered by the speakers. Anything else you can put in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat, but we'll be looking particularly at the Q&A forum for questions at the end. All of your mics and cameras are currently turned off, but when it is time to ask your question, I will change the settings so that you will then be on camera. If you want to be, you can turn your video off. But at that point, I'll ask you to turn your mic on and ask your question. If you would like your question to remain anonymous, that's fine too. Just let us know in the Q&A forum, and Mudit or I will ask the question instead. So thank you for joining us again. Thank you for your participation, and thanks to our speakers for joining us today. Over to you, Radha and Adrija. Please turn on your mics, and we thank you.
Okay, I want to first begin by acknowledging the people of the land and the First Nations of Australia, because although we are on virtual space, this is still a project that has its home in the First Nations of Australia. And I want to also pay my respects and tributes to the elders from and ancestors of the First Nations from whom I have learned a great deal. So, and I also want to thank Nisha for her very generous introduction. And it was overly generous, Nisha. You need not have said so much. But, and thank you very much. And to her team for setting this up and for giving us this opportunity to share a few of our thoughts. So I thought I will focus today. Nisha quoted that thing about, I had forgotten it actually, about the cage and how to get out of the cage. So I will focus on what the cage looks like, and maybe Adrija can get us out of it, which is a much more responsible task. So I will leave the bigger job to her. I first want to clarify that when I speak about the diaspora today, I am not a diaspora studies expert. I am not even a migration studies expert, and I am not a historian or any of those things. Yeah, I am speaking here about history and about diaspora in the UK in my capacity as an activist, because I was forced to learn about these things. As activists, we need to understand the world we live in. And that is the first responsibility of any activist. You need to know the kind nature of the world, and you need to know, what you're dealing with and what you're up against if you really want to address some of the issues that confront us today. So when I moved to the UK in 2007, I had to know the context in which I was living. And that is what prompted me to look at who is this Indian diaspora? Why do they behave in the way they do? What is their history? And so on and so forth. So that's where I'm coming from on this. What I thought I'll do is say a little bit about the nature of Indian diaspora in the UK. Yeah. But before that, any diaspora anywhere in the world, the character of the diaspora is shaped by interstate relations, because it is a relationship between the states that allows certain people to come in at certain moments and stops certain other people from coming in at other moments. So those migratory routes are very regulated by states. They are regulated by diplomatic relations, and they are regulated by interstate relations. And that shapes the character of the diaspora in any country. Now, as far as the Indian diaspora is concerned, there is a long-standing relationship between India and Britain that goes back to the East India Company in 1600. Yeah, so the diaspora is not something that has come just yesterday. It has not come something that has come in the post-war era. There is a long-standing relationship between certain sections of India and certain sections of Britain. And this is critical to understand the diaspora today. Now, I won't go into the long history, but in a very brief, in a nutshell, the relationship between India and Britain until, say, 1857 was formed by the East India Company, who had relationships with native princes, and the native princes some of them came to Britain, and there were, connections between Britain and India through this very aristocratic class, if you like, at that time. After 1857, we find there is a qualitative change. Yeah. So what happens in 1857? In 1857, we have what we call in our history books the First War of Independence, and what the British history books call the Indian Sepoy Mutiny. So whether you call it a mutiny or War of Independence, depending on where you are located, and this is an interesting one because it's the same event and the same war, but the fact that both history books give it great importance but from a completely different perspective, tells you something about the nature of the relationship and the bond. But it was the single biggest challenge to the British Empire ever until that point. So after 1857, the British imperial government had to change things. So what did they do? They took over the governance of East India Company. I call this the largest nationalization in the world because that's what nationalization involves, taking over a private company. And after that, the British government had to decide how they were going to govern India. And in the British Parliament, the debate at that time was, we cannot govern India on our own. We need allies. And so the debate between the conservatives and liberals was who can be our best allies. The conservatives said the merchants and landlords will be our best allies, naturally, right? And the liberals argued that the educated classes, what they call the educated classes, will be our best allies. Now, the reason this is important is that since then, the diaspora in the UK has been shaped by these perceptions of who are our allies. Alignment with the educated classes sometimes, maybe when the Labour government comes, or a more liberal government comes, and then with the landlords and merchants when the other people come. Now, this is a significantly different kind of migration, diaspora, compared to, say, diaspora who come because they're as refugees, who flee conflicts and come here. Palestinians, for example, the Kurdish, for example, the Somalis, for example. And these refugee communities who become the diaspora here bring with them a politics from their homeland. Whereas the Indian diaspora brings a different kind of politics. And I want to emphasize the point that since 1858 rather, that's when Queen Victoria made this proclamation called the Queen's Proclamation of 1858, where she promised to Indians equality in public services, access to civil services, equal treatment, respect for Indian laws and culture and all of those things. Since that time, there has not been a single British action, repressive or reformist or anything, that is not countersigned by Indians. So, for example, the Jallianwala Bagh, about which much is said, and it's the Jallianwala Bagh massacre occurred because of an extremely repressive law called the Rowlatt Act. And the Rowlatt Act is signed by 2 Indians. So on, and I could go on. The reason why this history is important to consider the RSS and the Hindutva agenda today, which is the main subject of our conversation, why this context is important, is after the decision to govern India with the cooperation and collusion of Indians, the British government decided that they were going to give Indians representation. And what was that representational politics? They said these Indians don't understand democracy and civil liberties and, all those kind of things. They only understand religion. And therefore, the representation would be on communal basis. So this is the origin where the story begins of where we are today. So what did that mean? It meant a system of representation where Hindus would be represented by Hindu organizations and Muslims would be represented by Muslim organizations. This structure of civil society was completely alien to Indian history. And you must remember that, because although Hindus and Muslims have lived in India and they've been very religious and everything, in the political domain, this kind of division was never there until 1905 reforms. And that is when the Hindus had to invent a political organization, and the Muslims had to invent their own political organization. Because if they wanted to participate in this governance structure that Britain had introduced, they had to have a so-called modern civil society organizations, right? And that is when we find the Muslim League comes into existence and the Hindu Mahasabha. And the Hindu Mahasabha is the predecessor of the RSS. Okay? And since then, the so-called democratization of Indian state has always relied on expanding communal representation. So modern liberal, democracy did not come to India waving the flag of equality, fraternity, and all of those things that you hear in the French Revolution. It came to India, the franchise came to India as a Hindu franchise and a Muslim franchise. I think these are some, I'm sorry if I'm sounding like a school teacher here, but these are so basic that sometimes we tend to forget it even when we know them, to put it into perspective. So now what happens with this? During the World Wars, you have, with the First World War, an extraordinary resistance movement that challenges the British Empire for the second time, inspired by the 1857 movement, which we call the Ghadar movement. And to put that movement down, Britain then had to, again, devise strategies. And one of the things that they do is the RSS, and in the Quit India movement, for example, in 1942, which Gandhi called for, complete freedom, etc., the RSS throughout the world wars supported the crown when India, the popular movements in India opposed it. However, and this is the important thing that you understand, this is not a homogeneous kind of a thing. At some point during the world wars, it becomes clear that, Britain wants to then now make a deal with the liberals, the Nehrus and the Gandhis and the, various others. And because they can't see any other way of getting out of their crisis. So during that time, RSS is frustrated with Britain because after supporting them to this extent, Britain now starts to distance themselves from the RSS. And so RSS turns to Hitler and takes inspiration from that. So you have a new crop of leaders now, which, and there is a new organization. It's no longer the Hindu Mahasabha, it becomes the RSS. And they then take inspiration from, and many of the older RSS leadership, some of them are still alive, have been to Mussolini's training schools. He used to conduct international training schools. So this is not just an academic thing about, nationalists, everybody. We have this tendency to just universalize everything, have an easy formula, and put everything into that formula. This is much more of a serious nexus and connection between the way imperialism, whether of the German kind or the British kind, works, and India. Okay, now in the post-war era, and they were the major instigators of partition, by the way, through their subversive actions. And you should hear some of the older people speaking about these stories, going to a mosque, throwing a, poor pig's head into a mosque, and then it starts a riot. This is how it started in a big way. And I think there is a film by Balraj Sahni, which I will let you know when I remember the name, on this question. So after partition, what happens, and after independence, there is a brief moment when this composition of diaspora in the UK changes. It changes because Britain has lost its empires and there are desperate labor shortages. So it is forced to now move away from elite immigration into Britain, all the Dadabhai Navrojis and the various industrialists and the Sir Thakursi and the Sir Sarabhais and all of those people, and there is an influx of very working class people, carpenters and builders from Punjab and so on. And there is also, in post-independence India invested in a very big way in public education, the IITs, the medical colleges, because the Nehruvian vision was to have, development and have self-sufficiency, etc. So from the 60s, we find this working class immigration and what used to be called the brain drain, that is public educated, well-educated Indians moving to Britain to take up NHS jobs, in the National Health Service and to various academia and various other places. But this is also a time when East Africans come to Britain, East African Indians, the Kenyan Indians, the Ugandan Indians, they come to India. So you have during that 60s and 70s, two very different kind of diaspora organizing in the UK. You have the working class, the carpenters coming from Punjab, where there was a very strong, peasant movement and then Marxist movement, communist movement, and so on, coming with that kind of thinking, who joined forces with people coming from the Caribbean, again, very strong communist movements there, and anti-colonial movements. So there is a convergence of these anti-colonial movements in which Indian diaspora played a brilliant role. They were there in the trade unions, they were there in the communities, and they've led the anti-racism struggles of that period. But that is 60s is also the period when the RSS, 1960s is the time when they start organizing in Britain, but there are no takers for their ideology in the British liberal or working class constituencies. So they start organizing the East African Indians, and that is where they first established their base among the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh people. And these are East Africans who have been displaced from their home countries. They were very often middle-class people who came to Britain, and who it was a huge traumatic moment. And this RSS then, working as the Hindu Swayamsevak Sangh or the HSS here, starts to organize them. And so both of these things have continued. However, in 1990s, what happens with Thatcher's reforms and neo-globalization and India's globalization and liberalization in the 90s, there are huge changes in the immigration laws in UK. And these changes in immigration laws now introduces what I call checkbook immigration. So, skills-based, tier 2 visas, where the working class people who came here, the bus drivers, the carpenters, they are no longer able to come to the UK. And instead, it is the software engineers, it is the upper caste people. And this class of tier 2 people are, generally speaking, upper caste. They are, generally speaking, what the old British used to call the educated classes. They are, generally speaking, urban people. And this is the class of people who come after the 1990s. And since then, if you look at the trade negotiations between Britain and India, Britain wants India to buy more arms. Britain wants India to open up markets for British goods. And the Indian government negotiates for more visas. This is a very important thing, because the visa negotiations, if you look at past several trade agreements negotiations that has happened, give us more visas, give our students more opportunities to work in Britain, and we will buy your arms. And that trade-off is an extremely important one for this composition. So what happens now, and I'll quickly wrap up, I don't want to take up Adrija's space here. We have today about 60 members of parliament from India, We have today, in the cabinet, as the Home Secretary or the Home Minister, a person who is an extremely close HSS person, coming from that Ugandan East African migration, original HSS, formation. I mean, she's the next generation of that politics, if you like. You have the son-in-law of Narayana Murthy, one of India's major industrialists, who is a beneficiary of globalization. He's not the old Tata Birla school, the established industrialist. He's a new industrial house that has come up. His son-in-law, whose wife is richer than the queen, apparently, according to the newspapers. And he is the exchequer of the chancellor. He is the finance minister of the country. You have 60 MPs in parliament across party lines, and many of whom are very solid supporters of the RSS and the Modi government. Yeah. And now with Brexit, you have, we have to do Brexit deals. We have to sell more arms. On the day, the US and the UK were sending, ventilators and oxygen and whatever to India to cope with the virus. There was also an arms deal between the US and India. Please don't forget this. This is the diaspora we are dealing with. And today, India is number 3 in its defense spending amongst defense spenders. First comes US, then comes China, and then is India. Britain is 5th in the position. So you can see, and arms trade is one of the important economic pillars of British economy. So this is the diaspora that we are living in. Now, because of the several waves of migration, and I'll conclude with this thing, we have many generations of, diaspora here. So you have people who go back to the colonial era, so who have probably lived here for 100 years. You have people who have lived here for 75 years, for 50 years, for 25 years, and people who have come yesterday. So this composition of diaspora makes it difficult for us to speak of the Indian diaspora as any homogeneous group. And so when we are organizing, we need to think, who is this Indian diaspora that we want to target? And many of the Indian diaspora that the media, for example, will regularly consult with, people who come and speak on COVID, people who come and speak on India, they look like me, but their connection to India, they don't know anything. In their thinking and in their mindset, they're very British. And this is something, just because somebody looks like me doesn't make them Indian, And this is and this class of Indians are everywhere in British media. You will find them television newsreaders, Krishnan Gurumurthy, somebody else, in the arts and literature. In other words, they are very much the educated classes who have very close ties with the educated classes in India. And these educated classes talk to each other, and the rest of India remains invisible as a result. So that is the kind of challenge. And there are some new groups who are coming in. People who have come in more recently are obviously much more tuned to what is going on in the country. But these people have not established themselves as well-known Indians in the UK. And so they don't have that same voice because they are not in places of positions of power. They're new, they've come here, they've been here 5 years, 10 years, maybe, whatever. But they're much more closely tuned into what is happening in India. So this is the scene in which we are forced to organize. Now you'll ask me, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Or how do we, what do we take away from this as far as organizing goes? And I think there are two points that need to be made. And I've already said that we can't speak of the diaspora as a homogeneous group. And because of the history of the collusion between the British state and the Indian state. India was the jewel in the crown, the title of our talk today. And India remains the jewel in the crown because India is crucial to Britain and to the Western powers for governance of all the other countries and so on. I won't go into that and therefore opposing Hindutva nationalism in countries like Britain becomes critical for what happens at home. However, in this fight is about Hindutva in Britain. It is not about Hindutva in India. Of course, it is about Hindutva in India, but it is about fighting the organizations here, the trolls who, the people who chase Oxford University to get rid of some history professor, so it happens here. The temple committees, which mobilizes for more Modi. And it is therefore becomes the Indian diaspora's job to say, look, the temples are not an RSS outfit. It's a place where all of us go to worship. Yeah, the election campaigns where Indian communities are mobilized on Hindu-Muslim lines. So there is a fight here, but in our mind, we think organizing diaspora is about organizing solidarity with India. But when we do that, we catch the tiger by its tail because the head of the tiger is here in the political economy, in the community, in the composition, etc., etc. At the same time, I don't want to, I want to end this on a positive note. Because of this positionality of progressive Indian, diaspora in the UK, we are in a position to play a genuinely internationalist role, bringing together not only Indians organizing in support of Indians at home, but at the same time supporting a wide cross-section of people, whether they are Tamils, whether they are Somalis, whether they are, all that, because our positionality as progressive Indians living in the UK allows us to do this. If you look at all the other diaspora campaigning, Kurds organize solidarity for Kurdish struggles. They do, on racism question, it becomes sometimes a purely, African descent or people of African descent kind of thing, leaving out the bigger questions about race in the UK. Or with the Palestinians, it becomes about occupation of Palestine. But Indians, because they occupy this position, in between position, in the contemporary empire, we are once again, I will say, like the Ghadar movement did at that time, at the turn of the 20th century, in a position to develop a genuinely internationalist, progressive movement. I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much, Radha. Over to you, Adrija.
Thank you so much, Radha. I have at least taken 5 pages of notes from this talk, so I am at this point of time not sure how much I can add to this because this was such a comprehensive background, but let me try. But I want to start by extending my heartfelt love, wishes, solidarity to everyone here and your friends and families and comrades back home in India. And these are extremely dark times, as Nisha said, and it's hard to keep, positive looking at what is happening back home. But I've always said that my space of healing has always been in organizing, in learning together, in building collective actions together with my comrades, and that's the only way that I know. So I want to say thank you to Nisha for organizing this and her team for giving us the platform to share some of my experiences. As Nisha said, I've been a student activist, and I just want to share some, strategies, experiences of organizing against the Modi regime and whatever's happening in India within the UK. But in the same way, I'm here also to learn from you. So if you have any ideas, strategies that has worked for you, please do share in chat. Please feel free to email me. The beautiful thing about being in webinars like this is to make these connections. So please feel free to reach out and continue some of these conversations and brainstorming more ideas of collective action. So I don't think I need to tell you anything more about the atrocities of the current regime and of Modi himself. So just to give you a little bit of backdrop following from what Radha was saying, and many of you may already know this, that after the Gujarat riots, when Modi where Modi failed to stop and actively encouraged anti-Muslim rioting that left thousands of people dead, uh, there was a diplomatic boycott imposed on Modi by several countries, including the UK. And this ban was lifted in 2012. So after becoming the prime minister in 2014, Modi visits the UK in 2015, and what a welcome he receives in the UK. Almost 60,000 British Indians from 450 community groups attended his rock star reception at Wembley Stadium. There were about 800 performers who participated in this free concert that preceded Modi's speech. And he was himself introduced on stage by the then British Prime Minister, David Cameron. So, and since this visit kind of coincided with Diwali, what it also featured what has been billed as one of London's biggest ever fireworks displays. But the question remains is that how did Modi go from becoming this, like, on a banned visa list to the UK to achieve such celebrity status? So it's important to know who are the people behind this grand rock star welcome of Modi in the UK. So this concert was not an official event which was organized by the British government. It was privately organized by a non-profit company called Europe India Forum, which was formed specifically for this visit, Modi's visit to the UK, and it was spearheaded by a multimillionaire British Indian industrialist called Nat Puri. And the fund not only received thousands of pounds of corporate funding, but it also received individual donations in various capacities from the diaspora community. Modi visited London again in 2018, and again, hundreds of people flocked to the streets to greet him. There were performances organized by various sections of the diaspora. And blinded by, what, Nisha was talking about as well, the development agenda of Modi, the upper caste diaspora chanted Modi's praises. Picked Modi supporters were allowed in this town hall discussion, while both the right-wing and liberal media from India, they were present there, but chose to completely ignore the protests that were happening just outside this town hall meeting, projecting this like perfect image of Modi to the larger public imagination. I was there at the protests in 2018, and I was, of course, denied permission to enter the town hall, which we applied for. But there remains an incident. So, I want to just this one incident which has stayed with me from that particular protest. So we were there outside Downing Street first, where Modi was supposed to meet the prime minister, but then he changed his route, and he did everything to avoid us. And then there was this time when we moved from Downing Street to Parliament Square. There was a group of young women. They were probably younger than me, and they were talking in Bengali, and they were wearing Bharatanatyam costumes. So because it's a language that I can identify and speak, so I kind of like the conversations came floating into my ears, and I realized that they were performing at the Modi reception, and that's why they were dressed up, and they were very excited. So this was just to give you a background. This is just after the Kathua case, and I had this huge poster of Asifa on my chest, and we were, chanting slogans around that. So I just wanted to have a conversation with these young women and kind of ask them, like, why were they so excited? Why were they performing with Modi? It was just more curiosity than anything else at that point of time. So I walked up to them and I asked them. And they were first very reluctant to have a conversation, but then they admitted that they were very happy that Modi had uplifted India's image. There was a, so much possibility for the youth now. They could proudly speak about India. But when I asked them that, what about violence against minority? What about Asifa, pointing at the picture which was on my chest, and they kind of point blank looked at me and said, no, it doesn't matter. And it kind of shook me a little bit for various reasons. It was, also my first experience to kind of understand that probably our organizing strategies needed to change, because how far removed some diaspora communities are from the reality of India. That was number one. Number two was I was actually shaken by the lack of empathy and the lack of connection. While they were saying that they are deep rooted in Indian culture and values, there's a deep lack of empathy about what is happening in India, right? And to understand, and there's a need to understand that, like why that is happening. But there's also the realization that we are very often having conversations in our own bubbles, and we are thinking that these conversations are great, but we are actually not extending and having conversations with various, like Radha was saying, this is not a homogeneous diaspora, right? How to reach out to these various different communities within the diaspora, and all of it requires different strategizing, and we are not thinking about that. And by we, I mean, like, I'm sure that there are several people who are like I'm talking about me, rooted within the movements, within the student movements that I was rooted in at that point of time. But I was also severely trolled after the event. And when Radha was talking about trolling, I also want to say that very often when you see that, like recently we were following some people who were trolling during the COVID thing that happened. And especially right in the beginning, when the people from Muslim communities and like were getting trolled in India, when we traced back the roots of this troll, a large amount of them were diaspora communities from UK and US who were trolling people in India. So this also needs to be remembered that is happening. But also the trolling that I was getting right after that event was mostly because I was not upholding a good image of India to the rest of the world. But what I was surprised about, what I was also getting trolled from the people who were so-called not pro-Modi, to saying that, yes, we have a little bit of a problem, but it's like they say, it's an internal matter. Why are you drying your dirty linen in public? Like, do you need to say that there are so many you're not patriotic enough? This is not patriotism. We don't support this. So I was getting trolled from the right wing, but also very much from the liberal sections of the diaspora and the Indian community. But also, at this point, I want to kind of develop a little bit on what Radha ended her speech on, that, how very much the tail and the head of the tiger, like how very much the politics of these two nations are very, very interconnected in many ways. Let me give you a few examples of that. So, I mean, Radha has already spoken about how the RSS, HSS have deep-rooted presence in the UK, and they operate through various temple networks. And they also have youth wings, by the way. And I've had some of them in my classes saying that they don't agree with my politics, which has been fun. But uh, but on a policy level, their anti-minority stand has been very visible when they vehemently, opposed the legislation to end caste discrimination in India. So in 2009, the British government introduced the Equalities Bill to counter discrimination in the UK, and Dalit groups in the UK built a strong campaign urging the British government to include caste discrimination in the bill. But irrespective of the strong support, this was never notified. And a freedom of information request later showed that the RSS has been lobbying in the UK with the UK government to say that if caste was included in the Equalities Act, it would create serious problems between in the relationships between UK and India. And an Equalities Act is one of the major acts which governs, like our institutions right now, where caste discrimination is very much present. Right? Like, think about universities as a structure. The only kind of overarching law that we have to kind of talk about discrimination within institutions is the Equalities Act. And caste discrimination is very, very much present within those institutions, right? Huge amounts of money is being sent from the UK to fund the activities of the RSS in India. So, there's an old report of by Avaz, which is a London-based watch group, which shows that millions of pounds collected by the British public, as charity, which is actually being sent to fund the activities of the Sangh Parivar. We know that it is actually happening today. We have the little bit of years that we have on ground. We know that this process is very much going on even today, that in the name of COVID, funds are being collected, it's being sent back home. Which of the organizations are being funded through that? 5,000 volunteers from the UK were flown in to India by the BJP in the 2019 elections to actually help boost their votes. This is a very strange story. I'm going to go off topic a little bit. I was actually flying back home during fieldwork at that point of time, and one of these people who was flying back from UK to India to campaign for Modi, very unfortunately or fortunately, was in the same flight as me. And obviously, throughout the flight, I had my ears to kind of find out what they were talking about, because they were constantly on the phone. And like before the flight, as soon as they landed, and all their conversations was, they were coming back from the UK. They belonged to a village in Rajasthan, and how they were like, have the buses been arranged? Can you use my name to say that, has that house been convinced? Can you go and tell the community that I am coming back and I vote for Modi? So, make sure how many buses have we arranged? Have the money been paid? So you can see that how the organizing, very much the grassroots organizing, is being done and funded by a certain sections of the diaspora. So, but also the other thing is that, very much the right-wing diaspora community, fueled by these nationalist sentiments from back home, have also hugely impacted UK politics. And one of the examples of that was, when the Labour government, under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, passed a statement in support of Kashmir after the abrogation of 370. 100 Hindu groups wrote to Corbyn to apologize and to take that down, which the Labour government then had to. The original stand was that they support the people of Kashmir, and then they had to kind of change it to that it's it's a thing between India and Pakistan, and we are not going to interfere. And it was a very strong statement that a lot of us had worked towards, bringing into the public discourse. But also, what happened after that was that it was just before the general elections, where, Radha was talking about, the Hindu community actively campaigned against the Labour Party, against Jeremy Corbyn, to say that we cannot vote for Jeremy Corbyn because he's anti-Hindu. Right? That was the main message. So I was canvassing in certain Hindu majority areas in London. And, we would knock on door and we would ask people that, hi, I'm from Labour. And they were like, oh, we don't want to have a conversation with you because you're anti-Hindu. And I'm like, or you have taken a stand against Kashmir. We don't want to talk to you. And I'm like, okay, that's a different conversation. I'm willing to have that conversation with you. But what about, you're going to vote for the Conservatives. The Conservatives have closed down schools in your area. Like, they have closed down the only medical walk-in center in your area. There has been massive cuts in education, in medical supplies. They have closed down community centers. What about that? You have 3 children. We don't care. Like, their basic answer is, it doesn't matter. You're anti-Hindu. I am Hindu. Right? So I'm kind of trying to say how deep-rooted some of these sentiments are, and kind of think about that in terms of when we look at organizing strategies. Right? How do we counter that in that context? And actually, interestingly, before the US elections, when Bernie took a stand against India and said something on Twitter, the people from BJP openly said on Twitter that, stop your anti-India stand, otherwise we will force to run a campaign against you. Like, think of the audacity. Like, and this comes from power. It comes from power, right? It comes from connections somewhere. So very quickly, I want to go on and talk a little bit about SOAS India Society, like the organization that I'm still part of, even though I'm technically not, like I'm technically in SOAS, but still, it's been my home for many years now. And since 2017, SOAS India Society kind of started developing this platform of dissent against the Modi government, and there was a reason for that. If you look at the fabric of the student societies or student politics in India, sorry, in the UK, there are two kinds of India societies. Firstly, they are they're very, what they say, apolitical, and they only organize Holi, Diwali, and Bollywood nights to say that we don't want to talk about politics, and hence the only idea that the larger international community has about India is Holi, Diwali, and Bollywood. Uh, and the second is that they're openly right wing. They're openly supporters of Modi in some ways, and in some cases, they are not even called the India Society; they are called the Hindu Society. Uh, and they do their artis, they do their pujas, and everything. But what we realized that there was, like, the international image is so important to Modi, and then there is, like, from the youth especially, there is no voice of dissent kind of challenging that and saying that we stand against these atrocities, we stand against this regime. And that is what we wanted to build. And since 2017, we have been organizing several protests, hosted talks, written petitions, done exhibitions, music programs, to tell people what is happening in India, but also to build this collective voice of resistance in the diaspora, right? And a voice that is anti-fascist, anti-capitalist, anti-caste, anti-patriarchy, from especially within the students' community. And since, like, some of our most important campaigns have been around UAPA, demanding the release of political prisoners in India, the Bhime Koregaon incident, uh, along with other organizations in the diaspora, we've organized some of the biggest marches in London. So on 15th of August 2009, with several other organizations. So this was after the abrogation of Article 370. We organized a huge march in Trafalgar Square. We campaigned actively around the CAA, NRC, and organized some of the biggest marches in London again, like responding to the call for the All India strike on 8th of January 2020. We organized the 12-hour occupation of the India House, which is the Indian High Commission. And in that space, we wanted to occupy that space for a couple of reasons. So one of the reasons, because this is a narrative that the Modi government has actively played in India, that, like, the students are going to universities to study, they are wasting taxpayers' money, so they should study, and politics is bad. And this is very much a sentiment which is echoed here, that politics is bad. So what we did in the 12-hour occupation was to basically say that we reject your neoliberal education system, we reject your marketized education system, and there is very much education and learning in the picket line. So for 12 hours, we constantly organized talks and workshops where people came and spoke about, like, India, Kashmir, like CA, NRC, Assam. We spoke about the Gadar movement. We spoke about Bhagat Singh. We did music workshops and theater workshops. So it was very much a space of collective action and learning. We also raised important debates around, like, a lot of the CANRC movements were about using the Indian flag as a symbol, or or citing the Indian constitution. But also, like, we were trying to have that debate of, like, why that might be contested, because, like, the Indian flag has, or the constitution has, only served certain communities in India. It has never belonged to Dalit folks, it has never belonged to Kashmiris, it has never belonged to our Adivasi comrades, right? How do we kind of disrupt some of these debates, and having internal debates amongst ourselves, right, and continuing our process of political learning? But irrespective of everything, like, in all our organizing, we had two key principles at our core, and we tried to maintain that in all our organizing. So, like, and the backdrop now from Radha's talk, that UK higher education is an extremely elite space. It's an extraordinarily elite space. Imagine that London school fees for international students, just fees for a master's program, can be upwards of £20,000. In that case, like, it is very often that students from India, I mean, who can afford that fees, right? It is only people belonging to certain communities can afford to pay that fees unless they are on scholarship. But again, there is a huge dearth of information. Like the information doesn't even reach certain communities, right? But very often it is students from India who would be traveling to UK for their masters or their PhD programs would get, show interest in joining our campaigns because they are aware of the current situation in India, right? But they were also, as Radha said, mostly from upper class, upper caste backgrounds, because how many Dalit Muslim comrades or people from minority backgrounds can afford these sort of fees and can afford to be in these sort of spaces. And we've always been very, very aware of that. So, and for that reason, one of the things that we've always done in our demos and in our panels is to, is to have our speakers, be women, Dalit comrades, Kashmiri comrades, comrades from queer communities, right? And these are the voices that need to lead our movements and set our agendas. And uh, we have always had a very clear stand on Kashmir. We have always, we have tried to do all our discussions through the lens of class, caste, gender, religion, and it is not only about representation. And I want to be very clear about that. Like, it is not only about representation, but actively standing in solidarity. And what that means in supporting our comrades from various marginalized backgrounds, but at the same time being aware that we are not co-opting these voices and taking up space, right? Which also means then having conversations about our own privilege, giving space, and what actual solidarity means within movements. How building coalition, what does that mean? Like of working together as a community. On that note, like actually I should say that there are some campaigns in India which are actually actively working towards helping students coming from marginalized background. So please use your knowledge that you have to help students coming from Dalit backgrounds, coming from other marginalized backgrounds, to help them enter into these elite spaces of academia, help them get access to scholarships, help them write SOPs. If you want, I can connect you to these groups in India. So do reach out if you can spare some time to help. Secondly, as what Radha said, so this was the first thing. The second thing is, we've always tried to operate holding a philosophy of internationalism, right? So all our oppression is connected, right? Modi, Bolsonaro, Trump, Johnson, Duterte, Viktor Orban, they're all at the end of the day made from the same fabric. And you can like see that they are joining hands. Bolsonaro is the chief guest in India's Republic Day parade. They are like, India is replicating Israel style occupation techniques in Kashmir. So you can see that they're actively learning from each other. They are actively supporting from each other. So the only way that we can even start an anti-fascist, anti-capitalist conversation is by developing an internationalist outlook and learning strategizing with comrades from all different movements across the world. We have organized events bringing together people from Kashmir, Kurdistan, and Palestine to have conversations and to understand what we can learn from each other. We've had speakers from Chile, Brazil, Iran, Iraq, Algeria, Hong Kong, Palestine, Thailand, Kurdistan to speak at our events, to find these connections and to build internationalist solidarity. Uh, most recently, actually, in the UK, if some of you know that the crime bill of 2021 is being currently passed, which actively, restricts protest. And, thinking about it, it is very, very much similar to the colonial era laws that we have in India, Section 144, right? And we understand we have lived through these things and we know the consequences of not standing up against that, right? So we have to also speak out against the crime bill of 2020, 2021, and how we can build those coalitions to do that. Before COVID, we were also like, we had plans to branch out from university campuses and do more community work. Something, again, things that we have actually learned from India in terms of like community education programs, reading groups, film screenings, and theater workshops within communities to kind of reach out to these different, these different parts of the diaspora through different means and start critical conversations. I think I've spoken for a lot longer than I wanted to. So I'm going to end here and with just one thing that but we've not always been successful. I'm not trying to romanticize this view of that we are this great movement at this greatness that we have achieved. We haven't. We have failed more times than we have succeeded. We have made many mistakes and tried to learn from them. Sometimes we've also been defensive and not learned. And then it was pointed out to us, the mistakes were pointed out to us, and we've tried to relearn, we reflected. Uh, our movements and campaigns, like all other movements and campaigns, are messy. And we have tried, but we have tried to keep, these two principles at the ones that I spoke about, at the very core of our organizing, and tried to build a culture of resistance through the work that we have done.
On the first question, I think both of us could answer. On the second question, also both of us could answer, but from very different standpoints. So I don't think we need to, divvy up questions unless we are sure we're going to say the same things. On the first question of Hindu-phobic thing, the space where that comes from, why every small thing, they'll say, oh, you are against Hindus. This is the RSS HSS strategy. And it mimics Israel's strategy. Anything you criticize Israel, state of Israel, oh, you're anti-Semitic. Yeah. Any criticism of any smallest statement in support of Palestinians, you should not use cluster bombs on Palestinians. Oh, you're anti-Semitic. And this is, first of all, the template for that critique comes from there. And I think we should understand where it's coming from. And it has come from active collaboration and cooperation between the Israeli state and this regime. So it mimics that. I'm saying this because once you understand the analogy, you can understand what is entailed in that. The second thing about Hindutva thing is that is why the language, and this is where I think I keep cautioning activists, please do not call it Hindu nationalism. It is not Hindu nationalism. It is Hindutva nationalism. What is the difference? Hindutva means Hindu-ness, something like Hinduism, a flavor of Hinduism. Yeah. Whereas Hinduism is what millions of people in India practice in their everyday lives. And Veer Sarvarkar himself, as Nisha said in her introduction, says very clearly, this is not about Hindu religion. He says it, not me. Not the anti-Modi people, not the anti-RSS. Veer Sarvarkar says, and I don't call him Veer Sarvarkar, by the way. I call him Vinayak Damodar Sarvarkar, because he's not Veer. Veer is a courageous person or a hero. He's not. So Vinayak Sarvarkar says in so many words that this is not, because he does not want to get into a debate about what is and is not Hinduism. If he got into that, he knew he was on a very slippery slope, because Hinduism, unlike many of the other Abrahamic traditions or other, is first of all not a centralized religion. It is not, it doesn't have a pope, it doesn't have a set of tenets. The only thing centralized about it is the Brahmins, who have been the ideological and social organizers of society. He does not get into that. And that is why he says this is Hindutva, that is Hindu-ness. It's like Hindus. It's not Hindus, it is something like Hindus. Yeah. And I think that is why this language is important, because the moment you start calling it Hindu nationalism, then they all jump up and say, see, they are against the nation and they are against Hindus. So you make the combination, you add nation plus Hindus. No, I think I'm a nationalist. I love my country and I love my people. But my country for me is my people. You know, it's all those people, millions of people, which includes the Kashmiris and the, you know, wherever it is. This is the equation they want to establish. You don't love your country. You don't love Hindus. And it's very important in the language we use. So I would urge everybody who's listening to be very careful about the language that you use. The third thing is on the question of you are anti-Hindus. Who are the Hindus? Yeah, are the Dalits Hindus? Are the Adivasis Hindus? You know, so you start minusing, then this great Indian nation becomes a minus category completely, because you take out the Muslims, you take out the Dalits, you take out the Adivasis, you take out all the, you know, who remains then? And therefore, and that is the nationalism, because what remains is the upper caste core. And that is what they are trying to kind of achieve. So my own response, depending on the level of conversation, whether it's a slightly higher level or whether it is what we call in Hindi tu meme conversation, you know, a tit for tat conversation, I say, yes, I learned Hinduism from my grandmother. And my grandmother did not say that breaking a mosque was Hinduism. Yeah, that is at one level of conversation, because we've all been raised by our grandmothers. Adrija, you were raised by your grandmother. She didn't teach you, you know, that you have to go and break a mosque to prove that you are a Hindu. None of us learned that. So that is at one level. At another level, and this is a more serious level, if you look at Indian history, and I have talked about this in other places, which I won't go, from about 11th century AD till about, let's say, the Gadar movement, you have a strong, across the subcontinent, from Sri Lanka in the south to Afghanistan in the north, to Sindh and you know, northeastern frontier provinces which is now in Pakistan, to East Bengal, you have a movement, social movements, very powerful social movements, and these are pre-modern movements, so before Marxism and before all of that, which are very strongly grounded in an egalitarian ethic, in anti-caste, in an absolutely uncompromising critique of Brahmins and priest class, whether they be Hindus or whether they be Muslims. Yeah, Bulle Shah, Jhulelal, you know, from the south, the Nayanmars, you know, the you know, various other Tevarams and the whole thing. This tradition we call the philosopher-poet tradition. Why is it called the philosopher-poet tradition? Because these were social thinkers, they were philosophers, but because they were speaking to the downtrodden, to the lower caste, to the peasants, to those communities, they composed their philosophy in songs and music, which are sung across India even today. Yeah, across India even today. So this is the Hinduism, if you want to call it that. That is the soul of ordinary working people in India. This is why even today, when this COVID pandemic, the government has not said one word about it. Show me one press release by Modi. Show me one press conference by Amit Shah. They have not said anything. But yet on the ground, millions of people are chipping in, setting up call centers, setting up helplines, taking people to hospital, organizing spontaneously. Where is that coming from? In that goodness must have a source. And to me, what the Hindutva politics is doing is to destroy that Indian tradition that has been the dissident tradition in India. Yeah, and it is this, and that can only be done by taking India to some, you know, non-existent past about which we don't know, so that the present, from the 11th century to now, 20th century, where we was thing, a period that we remember and know and understand, they want us to forget that. And so therefore I say, yes, let's bring back that tradition. Let us bring back the Bulle Shahs, let us bring back the Nizamuddins, let us bring back the, Namdevs and the things, so that, that to reassure people that we do have something good in us, because otherwise what happens, there was the ancient past, and then everything was oppression and suppression until the British came. And the British brought liberalism, and bingo, we realized we need freedom. As if women in India did nothing, between until the British came. As if the peasants in India did nothing and just waited for the British to come and teach us liberalism. And I think this is an extremely important thing that we on the left very often shy away from, claiming these traditions. This was the progressive tradition that is being murdered now by the so-called rise of Hindutva. So that is something that would be my thing. On your question of liberal rights, I won't say much because there is a whole book written on it, and I'll just leave it at that. So I'll maybe leave Adrija to deal with that, as well as
Yeah,
I mean, my
think you
book is
have-
exactly on this question: social movements, law, and liberal imaginations. So
Yes, I think I don't have anything to add about that. I mean, we've said, I mean, just like, we've several times, especially when I slogan, we all know the Halla Bol slogan, and I say Hindutva pe Halla Bol, and, very specifically, but a lot of people have come back and say, Hindu pe Halla Bol. I was like, no, I'm not saying that. Like, listen to what I'm saying. Like, so again, like all the time, just make that distinction, and it becomes very important conversation to have even in activist circles, like the kind of language that we use. And yeah, like human rights, please go read Radha's book. I have absolutely nothing to add to that. But I think there's a question for me that somebody wants to ask, so I will wait to answer that question. The Indian leftist movement, yeah, they absolutely, the Indian left, like, they have an extremely upper caste elite position. And the only way that, like, that there is an urgent need for the Indian left to kind of sit down and think about the caste question in its very composition, right? Like, how to kind of address because and I come from, like, I've been a part of the Indian left for a very long time during my student years, and uh, yeah, there is immediate need for introspection around questions of caste, and there's an immediate need to disrupt the casteist politics, which is still very much performed by people in leadership positions and the kind of things that are taken up. And I think the considering the the position of the left currently in India, it is a very, very crucial conversation to have. How is the UK, the left receives camaraderie from Indian Dalit and minority groups? I mean, again, I would have to, like, answer that through the lens of history. If you kind of look at it, when Radha was talking about the kind of people who were here and the anti-blackness movements in the 1960s and 70s, you would see that, like, the Indian Workers Association and organizations like that being formed, who had had an anti-class, anti-race, and anti-imperialist stand. And even within that, like, there was the critique of, like, the caste question was not very often taken up because a large portion of that diaspora was also coming from an upper caste background, right? The upper caste in the UK was also I mean, the political left was coming from the diaspora was also critiqued, because if you could see that the kind of migration that was happening, the upper caste people who came here, they already had a head start compared to all our comrades coming from a Dalit background, because they had land, right? So, and they had finances, so they had a head start in terms of. So these questions were even taken up very much during the movements of the 1960s and 70s, right? And again, like I was saying, that like, because caste is not a part of the Equalities Act, and very often the Equalities Act becomes the only kind of larger framework to look at discrimination within the UK, it very often within the larger context becomes very difficult to kind of talk about caste, right? And also there's an active negation, like, because of, like, I'm not even going to talk about colonial histories and everything. There is an active, like, invisibilization of these struggles, right? And I still think it is very, very important. Like, you go and speak to the, when we have spoken to people from the labor parties and labor movements and spoken about caste, they don't know. They don't know things about caste oppression. You go into a class, very progressive classrooms within the UK, right? Within UK elite university structures, and speak of caste. They don't know. But that doesn't mean that caste is like Brahminism is not replicated within these institutions, right? So one of the things that we have always done is that, like, in our organizing, in very small ways that we can, is to kind of we worked with anti-caste organizations in the UK, Caste Watch UK, other Dalit groups, and kind of learned from them, and kind of thought about like how we can practice this in our daily politics, but also kind of constantly challenged within the institutions that we have been a part of, to kind of say that this is a reality of people within your institutions. So in the way that you're talking about decolonization, you also have to talk about debrahminization, because it is a culture which is very much upheld by these institutions. And it's a work in progress, because, like, there is an active process of invisibilization of these struggles. And but also, like, we have to we've received l- rather, I don't want to say we have received tremendous support from Dalit groups here. Like, we have been in movements together, and we have supported one another, and we need to do more of that. Like, this sort of collective action is the only way forward in terms of thinking about larger organizing. I think it is not only, I mean, we invisibilize caste, right? There's an active invisibilization of the caste discourse in itself, right? There is so little conversations around it. And you've seen that the BJP there's an active, they've actively tried to co-opt these figures. Like, suddenly a Bhagat Singh becomes a BJP RSS figure, right? In the same way that they have tried to co-opt Baba Saheb, and, like, figures of, like, BJP people garlanding Baba Saheb and co-opting that figure, and telling them that, like, they were. So one of the things that we need to do is to kind of actively build a discourse around this, push this agenda forward, talk about caste in every discussion that we have, and kind of like fight against this co-optation of these figures, right? In the same way that, like, Radha was talking about our dissident traditions of, like, bringing Bulle Shah back, bringing figures of Bulle, bringing these dissident traditions back. We also have to kind of build a discourse. The left needs to, take this back. Like, Baba Saheb gave, we have to, I mean, what is the word that I'm looking for? I can't think of that word in English. I have the Bengali word in my head. But yeah, we need to reclaim. That's the word. We need to reclaim Baba Saheb. We need to reclaim Bhagat Singh. But I'm going to pass it on to Radha.
I think I echo what Adrija says, but I'll just add something to it. That is, I think, on the question of the left and caste. I think we make that question a one-sided one if we don't realize, if we don't recognize that there is a trio that is the target of Brahminism, and that the left then looks back and that is caste, gender, and Muslims. Yeah, those three things are together. They are tied together, and I think it's extremely important to understand this. That is why E.V. Ramaswamy, one of the earliest Dalit leaders in India, was one of the also the biggest canvassers of women's rights and women's freedoms, you know, including in the late 19th century to challenge the institution of marriage. And, you know, he was way, way, way ahead of that. So the Dalit question and the caste question and the Muslim question are inseparably tied. Why are they so inseparably tied? You have to go to Manusmriti, because the code, the Brahminical code, or the, you know, the law that the Brahminical, the source of Brahminical law. And in the Manusmriti's hierarchy, at the top comes the Brahmin, then comes the Kshatriya, or the warrior caste, then is the trader caste, then is the Shudra, and after the Shudra are women and cattle. So women and cattle are below the Shudras and outside of the caste hierarchy. So you have to understand this logic. And I deal with it. There was a question about how we deal with this, that if you want Manusmriti to go, you have to reverse that logic. So bring women and cattle, let's take cattle as nature, women and nature at the top, and then the castes, the Dalits, and then, you know, in that order. So that is the reversal. The problem with the left, which was your question, is they abandoned, there was, and one has to also remember, everything has a history. The early stages of the left, you know, post-Gadar movement, the Kirti communists, and across India, there was a proliferation of workers and peasants organizations. And these were organizations that tried to adapt socialism and communism to Indian cultural, social, and historical context. But since after about the 1930s or so, that eroded completely, and it was taken over by a brand of Marxism or left that was completely looking at Indian society through a European lens. So it was not about, you know, left, right. It was just about the way in which, so therefore India and this combination of Muslims, you know, women and Dalits got completely minused out of the left view of India. That is why partition happened. I mean, if the left had been successful, the communist movement was the largest movement after the Congress during the freedom struggle. But they couldn't deal with partition. They didn't know what to do with it. They didn't know how to deal with the women's question. They didn't know how to deal with the Dalit question. And these are very Indian questions. There is no template for this in Soviet communism or in Chinese communism or in British communism, for example. But it's that failure to Indianize, you know, the whole thing that we are talking about. Ambedkar, coming to Mudit's question, tries to do that. Ambedkar was not, you know, rabidly anti-communist as sometimes movements try to make him out. He tried to say, okay, these are the values that Marxism advocates. How can we understand those values in a context of a society that is completely structured by caste? But that is the debate that they want us to forget by garlanding his statues, but not his thought, you know, by BJP's takeover, as Adrija said, you know, of trying to. In Britain, in London, there is a house here near Chalk Farm where Ambedkar lived when he was a student. And it was the BJP, RSS, and the Maharashtra government that paid to buy his house and turn it into a museum and symbol. And everybody here in Britain thinks, oh, this is a great thing, you know, because, but it is not coming from the anti-caste and this alliance. And anti-caste movements can only become strong when the other two components are integrated with it. The gender question and the Muslim question. If they are not brought together with the caste question, caste is going to remain in new forms, and we can say this forever. And that is why it's important to understand both how this three is structured by Manusmriti and how doing away with Manusmriti requires bringing together the caste question, the women's question, and the Muslim question. Sorry, I'm taking more time than.
Thank you so much.
But this is so interesting, no? Sorry, Nisha, I was just about to say, and I was thinking that, like, the left currently also, and it's a conversation that we need to have in the contemporary, because, very much we are still kind of looking to European forms of, revolutionary ideas for solutions in the Indian context. And it's very much today's reality as well. Right. So I think what Radha said is the only way forward to kind of think about and Indian solutions to the problems that the subcontinent is facing right now.
We heard Biju say something very similar at the beginning of his talk in the first webinar. He started by making the comment that, and I'm paraphrasing very crudely, but that we're spending too much time trying to understand Indian fascism in terms of European experiences of fascism, historical or contemporary. And so I'm reminded of that. I do have one more question myself. The question is very specifically about textbook wars in the UK. So I know anecdotally from my research that the same kinds of politics that are well documented in the US have played out in the UK around representations of Hinduism in English textbooks. Yeah. Do either of you have a comment on that? We know, you talked at length that they are present in university campuses. So the question I'm really asking is, what do we know, or what should we know about Sangh influence into schools? Not just their youth camps and VHP camps, but English public school system.
Thank you for that question, Nisha, because after I finished, I realized I left out an important point. So, and your question really helps me to come back to that point, which I had missed out when I was talking about the composition of the Indian diaspora, etc. During Tony Blair's time, when he was our dazzling Prime Minister of Britain, he introduced what is called faith schools. Okay. And these faith schools have been very, very controversial for a number of different reasons. But to your question about what the faith schools did was, the HSS was in an extremely well organized, because they are a small, centralized, well-knit organization, extremely good position to take over that space of faith schools. So the faith schools were established at a time when all the checkbook immigrants were coming in. And the checkbook immigrants were, of course, for them, it was win-win situation, because they got British salaries and British jobs and Indian culture and Indian education for their children. For free. So it couldn't be more win-win than that. And the faith schools, of course, set the agenda for what is taught as what goes in the name of Hinduism. Yeah. For example, one of our at least this used to be one of my criticisms of them, which I don't actively pursue now. They used to say, in the faith schools, they only serve vegetarian food for children. Now, there are many Indian children who go to those schools who are not vegetarians, right? Because not all, it's only the upper caste that is vegetarian. Yeah. And then the children used to be taught, these are little kids, primary school children, about the greatness of vegetarianism and whatever, and, all of that. So we used to at that time say, no, this is not, this is only a small section. There are children who eat meat at home, and, that this shouldn't be portrayed as Hindu thing. So that's kind of one example. But I'll also give you another example of how this faith school thing then spread to higher education. A lot of our student societies, and I discovered this quite serendipitously. The student society, we have a Hindu society and a Muslim society. Now we have a large proportion of South Asian students. So they celebrate Iftar and they celebrate Diwali and all of that. And all the festival students being students, there is all of Bollywood singing and dancing and halwa and, henna and all of those things. So one day I asked one of my students, I said, why do you do this Hindu society and Muslim society? Why don't you just have a South Asian society? Because all of you eat the same mithai and you have the same henna and you have the same Bollywood and all of you drool over Shah Rukh Khan. So why do you want to have two different societies? And these girls said, oh, I didn't think about it that way. So we'll go and ask our student societies. So they went and asked their student societies why we don't have a South Asian society and why we have a Hindu and Muslim society. They came back to me and they reported and they said, no, ma'am, this is not possible because, and that is when I learned this, that it is the British Islamic Council and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad who establishes these societies in the universities. So they come to the universities and they establish the Hindu society and Muslim societies as part of the student societies. And I said to them, but you know, student societies are supposed to be established by students. You know, not by some Hindu council or Islamic Council of Britain or whatever. And the students said, but that's how it happens and that's what the universities do. And they had no voice in that, even though they were quite happy about the idea of having a South Asian society, which they could all then, you know, do the same songs and dances and whatever else they do. So this is a, you know, example of how that agenda is shaped and the extent to which the British government is hand in gloves in shaping that agenda.
I mean, I completely 100% agree with Radha. Like, you know, every time in SOAS, we would have every time, and this is every Freshers Week, there would be a bunch of, and this is something that we did in, you know, after a while, we got tired of telling people like, this is our political stand. We do not do Holi, Diwali or any Brahminical festivals. There's a reason for that because, you know, there's a whole story of like, you know, caste backgrounds and things like that behind that. If you want to talk about that, very happy to talk about that. But also this is a political society, not a, I mean, we do cultural events, but like, you know, they're related to resistance, protest. And again, like, you know, we do a program called Jashn-e-Sangharsh every year, which is celebrating women's voices and resistance to celebrate International Working Women's Day. So, and things like that. And we put the posters of that in front of our stall so that people like know exactly our politics. But every year there would be questions of like, you know, why don't you do, why can't we do, you know, Holi, Diwali? And there's a petition that we need to do a Hindu society and we need to convert SOAS India society into a Hindu society. And for like the last 4 years, we have fought tooth and nail to say that we will not we will not allow this. But this is exactly that. And many of the students who are here as well, you don't realize that they come from like, you know, they've all been trained in this through temple networks, through Sunday schools, which is in like, you know, along with the faith schools, there are these Sunday schools which operate in temples. And, you know, their thing is that, oh, like RSS is not bad. They do seva. You know, that's what we are taught. They do seva. But in the name of that, this whole Brahminical tradition that they are taught, and they are said that this is what India is, and that is only what India is. Right. So that is one aspect of it in terms of, you know, the kind of people who are you know, the kind of student from the student side of it. The other side of it is also look at two things. OK, so one of the things right now that is happening is that you can see that the Indian diaspora is working very closely with the conservative governments, right? Right after the 2019 elections, I remember Radha and I had a conversation where, like, you know, these people from the diaspora were sitting with conservative MPs and having these discussions, and it kind of goes into funding. And so right now, if a person from Oxford, there's a huge petition to bring down a person from Oxford because they're writing about caste. What is the kind of research that is being supported by departments, right? People are now fearful of doing research, critical research around India. Critical research around India will not be funded anymore. One of the biggest fundings for research around India is for yoga studies, right? So that is also, so there is like, so there are, in terms of like understanding the structures of, you know, the Brahminical structures and of UK academia, and I say like Brahminical structures of UK academia, right? There are several forces which are playing a part. So like there's a school, there are Sunday schools, there are there is influence in terms of money with what research is being funded. There is also influence in terms of what voices are being said, like don't say this, you can't, like, visas are being denied to academics coming into India who are writing about being critical about the Modi government. It is not only that their visas are being rejected, their PhD students visas are being rejected. So we know that if there are so if I have a PhD student today, I know of cases where students have had to remove me as a, like, I'm just giving you an example. This has not happened in case of me, but like remove me as a supervisor and take somebody else because they won't get a visa to go to India because I speak about. So there's not only having effects on me, having effects on the community as a whole, right? So we have to understand all of this as a very structural problem.
I can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time and knowledge. Thank you for joining us. And I'll just say good night or have a good day. I won't keep you, Adwaita, anymore from where you need to go. Thanks to those of you in the audience who are still with us. I apologize if we didn't get to your questions, but we do have to let our speakers go today, but you know where to find them.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Please do reach out, like on social media, like DM us or like email us. Like very happy to, the whole point of like, doing this is to build collaborations and to like, learn from each other and to work together. So please do reach out if, and continue these conversations.
Thank you. Thank you, Adwaita. Thank you, Radha.
Thanks.
Well.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to all the other speakers in your series.
Thank you. We're taking them one at a time, but thank you. Take care.
Bye.
We'll
As
be
we
in
say,
touch.
Inqilab Zindabad.
Inqilab Zindabad.